Some of you are probably very competent and familiar with taking an app to market, but the reason why we developed this roadmap together with our mates on Tunbridge Wells Trust partners was that we wanted to try and get the wider NHS to have a mechanism and a simple way by which they could try and navigate through what can be, depending on the nature of the healthcare app, a quite sort of challenging path to navigate. So that's the purpose of the roadmap. The roadmap is being published imminently by the Oxford Academic Health Science Network. I was hoping that would be available today, and it isn't. So on your USB sticks, you've all got draft copies of what is a quite substantive roadmap document. Alan's just touched on the surface there, but hopefully that might be of interest. Right. People falling asleep on me now. Right. Okay, so both the roadmap and what I'm going to go through with you now is part of the output of the IPO Fast Forward program from last year. This next bit of work, we've been sort of also, like many other people, looking at various different business models associated with healthcare apps. And actually, how do you make these things sustainable in the longer term? Okay, right. So as an innovations hub, we get lots of great ideas for apps. Many people come to us wanting to develop a variety of lifestyle or practitioner healthcare apps. And I think we'd be remiss not to say that in some cases there's a very clear case for charity or an industry to actually fund that app. Therefore the problem in terms of funding is sorted out. Quite often, a number of charities may fund either the development or actually to deploy the app to a specific target group of users, maybe certain groups of users with a particular long-term condition, etc. But I think we have a problem with that because we're seeing so many healthcare apps out there at the moment that I think over time it's going to be increasingly difficult for charities, pharmaceutical companies, healthcare companies to increasingly say, well, okay, I'll give you the funding to develop that app. It's happening now, and I'm not saying that charities won't continue to support the deployment of relevant apps for a certain subset of the population, but it's probably longer term not the best model or way forward of actually sort of funding the app. We've also got a societal benefit model there, and what I mean by that is we've seen some cases of apps possibly being funded by Public Health England to look at certain groups of users in society, and their remit, their responsibility is that they're quite happy to sort of fund those sorts of ideas. We've then got sort of two other categories. We've got what I call the no-brainer app, which I talked to some of you over lunch, and then we've got all of those others that we'll cover in a moment. So, in terms of, well, how do we make these apps sustainable longer term? Who's going to fund this longer term? Part of the challenge that we've got is that we know that you can't just go on download numbers. We know there are in excess of 97,000 healthcare apps out there, over 30,000 alone just on the Apple platform. Localytics.com have done a study over 3 consecutive years and pretty consistently across those years found that 22% of apps downloaded have only ever been used once. We've conducted our own survey across The data that we've got in so far suggests that 84% of NHS staff only use apps once after downloading. So they're obviously a bit more concerning than other users. Okay, so no-brainer apps. These really are the apps that the trust says, well, look, it's really going to make a difference to us. We should be doing this. They'll fund it, whatever the cost. Now, as Alan has already sort of touched on in terms of the roadmap, NHS organisations will approach this in a number of ways. They may commission the new work with the external developer and actually seek to own the IP. The developer may come in and say, we'll build it on our proprietary platform solution, and there may be a one-off license arrangement or maybe even a subscription, ongoing subscription of some form. And increasingly, we're seeing a number of NHS organisations actually developing apps internally, a lot of software internally, and certainly since the demise of NPFIT, we've seen a lot more of that going on. So in terms of characteristics of the no-brainer apps, one example would be an app that improves communication between staff and the patient. A lot of these sort of apps do improve staff morale. These apps may offer no clear income generation, but actually the reason why the trust will do it is often because there are some form of cost savings involved. There's a whole myriad of KPIs that the NHS organisations need to perform to and meet. I'll put some examples there, such as tackling unmet clinical needs. Sequin metrics have increased. Some of the sequin metrics, which are system levers used in the NHS at the moment, have now moved into the national contract. So some of the innovative activity that was previously measured under this thing called sequin is now migrated into the day-to-day contract. So there's a lot of pressure on these NHS organisations to meet these objectives, and in cases where the app is an enabling technology that helps them address some of those objectives, it makes the app development decision, well, a no-brainer. The app may actually help an existing service to be provided or capability, or particularly in the cases of areas such as telehealth, telecare, some of the new integrated service provision that's been developed up. The app actually may contribute to a new service or capability that that NHS organisation is looking at. Again, like there is probably not much pressure to actually generate any sort of direct income to keep it going, there may also be no immediate need to exploit outside the organisation. It's a no-brainer. We're doing it because as an organisation, we need to do it. And ultimately what all of this means for that organisation is that they improve delivering patient care in terms of quality, safety, and patient experience. And again, NHS organisations are measured on each of these areas. So that's the no-brainer side. But what do we do in terms of all of these other apps that we need to try and justify? And how do we actually look at ways in which we can make some money out of these? So looking at some of the other common models that people are applying or starting to apply, and many of these clearly come from the gaming industry originating. Looking at pay to download, we have a slight sort of challenge. And the challenge that everyone who's tried knows is that as consumers, and both NHS staff and patients are consumers, consumers are increasingly reluctant to pay for apps. There are so many of them out there, and so many of them are free. Now, again, some of the Localytics research suggests through a variety of device platforms, there is a proportion of users who actually will quite happily pay are relevant for them. And when we asked the question of NHS staff recently, we had a similar response. 61% of NHS users surveyed said that they're quite happy to sort of purchase apps. So that's fairly consistent. So our survey captured about just under 6% of staff from this trust. It was roughly a 70-30 split, female to male. 45% of the respondents used smartphones, 5% using tablets, and 46% used both tablet and smartphone. And we had age range from the relatively young to the not so young. 55% were doctors, nurses, or midwives. That logo's missing 12%, I think it is, allied healthcare professionals, and then a mix beyond that, 13%. So 46% of users in the NHS that we polled have downloaded a medical app onto their device. And you probably won't be surprised by this next graphic. 60% of those paid less than £1 for an app. 27.3% paid a bit more, but essentially they're not paying much money, and we had, was it 0.9%? 1%, I think it was 5 users spent more than £50 on an app. I've got the details somewhere of what they were paying for, but certainly wasn't Angry Birds. So we asked them, what is the most that you would actually spend on a medical app? And pretty much 70% was split between the £1 and £5 mark. There's clearly pricing sensitivity, there's clearly sort of pricing conditioning in the market. If you try and sell an app for more than £5, you'll get some users, but people feel somewhat challenged. So we think there is a market. We think that if you've got the right sort of app, why shouldn't people be willing to pay for it? And we think people will be willing to pay for it. There is a limit, clearly, to what people will be willing to pay. As I suspect Scott might point out later, ultimately, any app is only as good as the value perceived by the user. So everything that we're discussing here is very app content dependent. What is the need in the market? How well have you really conveyed that value to that sort of end user? What's the user experience like? We know a number of companies are now looking to personalize apps as a way of trying to get that user experience much greater and people to take up those apps to a greater degree. A number of professional guidelines now can be downloaded as apps, as electronic guidelines. People seem to be quite happy to sort of pay for those, as an example. And these sorts of apps, people may pay one-off fee, but actually in the case of maybe things like guidelines are updated on a particular frequency, there's no reason why people would not pay more, and we've certainly seen that with some of the electronic guidelines. Right, Alan touched on IP earlier. One of the roles that we provide to the NHS is to sort of help manage intellectual property, which admittedly makes some people sort of switch off straight away. But in the context of where value is and the reason for justifying a sort of price, we think that there can be unique IP in some of these mobile healthcare apps. Alan mentioned source code lends itself to copyright. But we shouldn't forget things like database rights and some of the design elements that might lend themselves to the apps as well in terms of user interface and so on and so forth. And And algorithms, bit of a sort of prickly subject, that one, but actually some of the very complex algorithms can form unique IP. And this offers, we think, good opportunities for the NHS to collaborate with developers to bring together complementary skills to actually sort of tease out and create this unique IP. Now clearly, if you've got an app that you've developed that's gone through a fairly rigorous CE-marked medical device process, then why shouldn't somebody pay for that? You know, there's no reason for somebody not to pay a fair and reasonable amount of money that the market will sustain for something that's actually proven, regulatory proved. So I think we can sort of beat ourselves up maybe a bit too much that, well, nobody's going to pay for it. Well, a lot of the apps that are out there, as mentioned this morning, are sort of quote unquote for research only. There aren't that many apps out there that are actually CE-marked at the moment. All of these business models, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive because we think there's actually also a lot of overlap between some of these, to come back to. But this is where people expect the business models to be, because they think, well, hang on, the market demands and dictates that these apps need to be free. And if it's free, how do I actually generate sufficient income to make the app sustainable? So then we look at the other traditional models. We're quite in favour of this one at the moment, the pay-as-you-go model, in-app purchasing. Very much like the pay-to-download. People will only pay for it if it's got relevant content for them, the value perceived by the consumer. We like this because we've seen examples where people have used it to actually stimulate the market. And there are various examples right across the digital industry at the moment where you get free trials, free to download, but do you know what? If you want to use it beyond a certain period, you want to unlock certain functionality, there will be a sort of fee. And we think there may be a role in the NHS for some of that, and I'll come to that in a moment. And interestingly, 71% of all Apple Store revenue in 2013 was from in-app purchases. So this is actually quite a big revenue spinner, particularly if you're an app store. So, well, let's ask the NHS. We said, have you ever made an in-app purchase with any of your downloaded apps? I was quite surprised by this. I thought they're actually quite a conservative bunch. 27% said yes, 73% said no. We went on to ask them, well, what do you actually think about in-app purchasing? And I don't want you to sort of labour too much on the figures, but essentially, roughly 60–65% either agreed or were neutral to the idea of paying as they go. The big message we got from this was that users said that if I actually sort of download an app, I actually want to be able to use it without any other further purchase. So is it a relevant business model for the NHS? Well, we think it can be. Myself and Alan have been discussing recently about an app that we've been looking at. And we think there are situations, particularly where you've got businesses transacting with other businesses. So let's use an example. If you've got the hospital here providing an existing service to a primary care practice, business to business. Okay. They're already providing that service. Could that service be provided more efficiently via an app? Quite possibly. Does that primary care practice have a regular sort of flow? Maybe, maybe not. Is it intermittent service? Yes. So if the app provides the service more efficiently, from a hospital perspective, there's cost savings there, efficiency savings there. From the practice perspective, communication may be slightly improved, maybe slightly quicker. We like the idea of that. We think that this pay-as-you-go could work. So you've got that primary care practice essentially saying, I need this, bang, pay. So we think it works in that situation. Where it becomes a bit more challenging is in terms of NHS to patient interactions. In fact, I think maybe almost impossible. Because for an NHS organisation to develop an app, to give it either directly to a patient or through a third party, such as a council collaborator or social care or what have you, and that patient then to come across this pay-as-you-go, doesn't work. So we don't think it works there. Does it work in lifestyle apps? Yes, we've seen examples where lifestyle apps, you get the app for free, get hooked in it to download, not just weight calculation, but something else over here, you have to pay a bit more. We've seen it sort of work there. Does it mean you sell more? Not necessarily. So we've seen the emergence of a number of shell apps with lots of different sort of modules, which allow people to maybe sort of pay as you go. I've got a junior doctor group up in Oxfordshire at the moment that have got a shell app for use of junior doctors. They're developing different modules, different content. And they're actually going down this route at the moment because they know certain groups of doctors want certain modules, but not necessarily others, or right now, but they might do in due course. And we've looked at the market around that, and it seems to be the appropriate model for them. Then we come to the app package. Now, Ian touched on this over lunch. We're, in the broader software sense, we know that there are a number of vendors out there that are providing routine services, usually business to business, sometimes business to patient. People are using a variety of software, particularly in telehealth, telecare, to actually sort of facilitate that. We've helped develop a bit of software ourselves in the research community. That particular model that we've gone down is a software as a service model that works very effectively in terms of broad provision, hosted software, and the parties actually pay on an annual basis for maintenance and support and so on and so forth. And we think if you've got the right sort of app, the app is wrapped up into a broader provision of service, then it's no different. But again, it's dependent on the content of the app. And in some cases, it may be not an annual sort of fee. It may be pay as you go, as and when you need it, as we've just sort of covered. And then we've got this other area in terms of the app package, in terms of integration with other technology. So this is the Within's blood pressure monitor. When they first started off, they had a wired iPhone to brand new blood pressure cuff, and that would basically monitor and calculate, record, document your blood pressure over a period of time. And they've now moved on, that's now sort of wireless, but here's an example where essentially the business model is quite simple, because you can charge what you might normally charge for a blood pressure cuff, but actually you can work it so you give the app away for pretty much next to nothing or nothing. So integration with other technology, and we're starting to sort of see that in the field. I haven't seen it with any NHS organisations at the moment, where I think that will happen. And then we come to a very sensitive area and a very contentious area in terms of advertising. if you are going to offer the world a free app, can you generate revenue off the back of it through advertising? Possibly, I think is the answer. First issue we have is NHS culture. There are some very strict brand guidelines that the NHS issues around sponsorship, around advertising, in terms of what can be advertised and where. There's also something called the Estates Code, which is used in terms of buildings and premises, and again in terms of what can be advertised, where, and so on and so forth. Doesn't obviously quite cover healthcare apps, but essentially there is a requirement for the NHS to identify appropriate adverts, place them in the appropriate place, use them in the appropriate way, and for people not to sort of question or have sort of concerns the motive or the reason why certain adverts have been used. And it's quite interesting because when we first started this work, we saw a normal trust website here, and I don't know how long ago it was now, Steve, but the website was redeveloped, wasn't it?
Yeah,
it was
absolutely.
a little while ago, and I know now if you go to the Maidstone Tunbridge Wells website, you'll see that the trust has banners on its own website with carefully selected suppliers and sponsors like Bernardo's and a few others, which actually sort of helps maintain the website. But there is a challenge because essentially, I think within the NHS environment, it's going to be very restrictive in terms of the sorts of adverts that you either push through as on banners or as, on splash screens. The area where we think it's a bit easier is actually using the push messaging on apps, on devices, and actually pushing out not so much third-party endorsements, but pushing out to consumers about changes to the app they've already got. So this supports in-app purchases, app package model, and might help migrate the sort of consumer. So we think that's probably more acceptable to users that have made the decision to use that app. Certainly in terms of NHS staff. So from an NHS perspective, are carefully positioned and targeted apps an acceptable compromise if it means the app is free? 76.4% of users said yes. 23.6% said no. And then we asked the same question but said, okay, this time around, what if the apps in consideration were actually apps derived from the NHS? We'd made no mention of whether they were for patients or for other members of staff. We just said they'd come out of the NHS. And suddenly it changed. They said no. 55% said yes. 44% said no. So there really is a sort of mindset in terms of apps developed by the NHS and the way in which adverts should or shouldn't be seen. So should NHS apps carry adverts? Well, survey said, well, if it's an app just for NHS staff, 67% say, yeah, okay. But if it's a patient app, we can't do that. There's no way we should be, well, it's 50-50. 50% said yes, 50% said no. So there's clearly a lot of sort of anxiety about bombarding patients as end users of these apps with adverts. There was a wide spectrum of comments. I've just selected a few. I think one of the messages that came out very clearly throughout all of this was that if trusts are going to put adverts into healthcare apps, the adverts should not compromise the impartiality of NHS services. I think that was a pretty broad answer across the board. And then we had a number of sort of variations. So some people felt, well, if you are going to put adverts, make it completely unrelated to health. And then we had somebody else say, well, actually, if we're giving these devices or these apps to patients, let's use the adverts in a positive way in terms of health promotion, healthy food, smoking cessation, and so on and so forth. It's quite interesting. When I started this a year ago, I asked our counterparts all around England in terms of their views, where they got to, what their trusts are doing. And one of them turned around and said, I went to speak with the trust executive, and we had a discussion about adverts, and they said, there's no way we're going to allow any of our apps that we choose to develop to carry adverts for patients. We don't care about the hospital consultants. If the app is for the hospital consultant, you can bombard them. We don't care. So the individual concerned took this conversation a bit forward with an intermediate and went to this advertising company and said, okay, if I've got this app and I can actually target hospital consultants using this app, would you be interested? Well, the advertising company sort of fell off their chair. They immediately put a few phone calls in, and within the space of 2 hours, they had offers from Mercedes-Benz and BMW to actually more than willingly pay a healthy sum to push their latest car adverts onto an app for the hospital consultants. So don't read sort of too much into that, but I think it just demonstrates that we have to be sort of very careful in terms of the intended audience. So part of this is about NHS culture, part of this is choice of adverts. There are also concerns about content control and security. How well can you control the type and nature of the adverts that get pushed out onto the app? Do you have any control? If you're an NHS trust and you've now relinquished the responsibility to a third party through a license or some other mechanism, do you actually have any control over the means by which those adverts are decided and so on and so forth? So we think there's still a lot of work to be done around that. And I think actually there's a business there for companies that actually can provide a sort of ethical, whiter than white advertising mechanism that would actually support, encourage the NHS to say, okay, we've got a means by which we can control this, and we can prove it to you, we can show you, we can demonstrate to you. Because as somebody, might have been Scott, actually said to me the other week, you know, if you are dealing with a diabetes or obesity app, the last thing you want is a McDonald's advert to come sort of winging down onto the app. Final thing I wanted to discuss with you is code trading. Now, I know some of you will be familiar with this. I have one colleague in the north of England that is currently looking at this within an NHS environment. Most of the parties I've spoken to are blissfully ignorant about this as a potential business model. I wouldn't say it's the easiest business model, and I wouldn't say it's the quickest business model, but if you've gone through the appropriate steps with a collaborator or done it yourselves, if you've developed unique IP, if people are using the app and there is value, perceived value in that source code, there are a myriad of marketplaces out there that will happily trade source code for a fee. So I'm not aware of any NHS parties doing it at the moment, but we think it's certainly there as an option. And the colleague that I spoke to a while ago said, well, we are thinking of looking at reskinning apps. And essentially what they were looking to do was to take a robust healthcare app that they developed some time ago. It was, as healthcare apps go, moderately successful, but they were looking to now sort of modify or improve the user interface, give it a different look and feel, possibly add additional functionality. And the interesting thing is that as you delve into this, you see that reskinning can potentially lower the barrier of entry into the app development world with a higher potential for return on investment. So I wouldn't say it's for the uninitiated. I wouldn't say it's for the faint-hearted. I'm not saying it's an easy business to sort of be in, but having discussed the issue around app sustainability, how do you get into the app development in the first place? Are we reinventing the wheel? I think as more and more of these healthcare apps develop and mature, we're going to see a lot of this relevant, useful code available and out there. And it may be that the starting point is actually here to take something that's already out there, rebadge it, redesign the user interface, add in additional functionality, maybe do that a lot sort of quicker. So, in summary, clearly the choice of business model or hybrid business model is dependent on your target consumer, functionality of the app, do you have unique IP, brand value. We think there's a lot of benefit in terms of brand value. If you are developing a series of credible, regulated, proven, clinically safe apps, meet all of the data security requirements, got a buzz, got a lot of reputation, people like it, patient like it. You can build good brand value over the time, but the NHS again is still dabbling, sort of dipping its fingers in, but I think over time we'll see some consolidation in this area, and we'll see certain groups really sort of develop strong brand value in this area. So our particular areas that we like at the moment, we think revenue generation can be achieved from non-patent IP, source code, particularly where the app is CE marked. We're looking and exploring a number of situations where we might go down an annual fee route for an app as part of a service, and we think that is a sustainable model. We're aware of code trading. We're not looking to sort of dabble ourselves at the moment, but we think as this area matures, code trading will become a more viable model. And any app developer recognised for producing certified apps, particularly associated with a recognised medical body or several medical bodies, I think there's a lot of value in there. So it's interesting what you were saying earlier over lunch, Steve, because I think ties in, there's lots of potential there. And again, it's not on here. I think from an advertising perspective, I think if you've got a demonstrable way in which you can actually sort of push relevant, timely, safe adverts in a way that deals with the NHS culture and the requirements of the end user, the requirements of the NHS organisation, again, I think that there's a great revenue potential there. The end. Thanks for your time.
Okay, thank you. I think some of the comments on advertising are blowing some of my plans to rule the world. I have plans for an app that geolocating. As you walk into an NHS organisation, it checks the CQC rating and serves that either for negligence lawyers or undertakers, depending on how low it is. Maybe that won't fly. We now move on to our last speaker of the afternoon, Scott Haig, who's Managing Director of Integrated Change. who is going to tell you some things about some of the services he's offered and some of the routes to market that might be available to you as a developer. Scott.